Welcome to the Pacific Research Institute Next Round podcast. I'm Tim Anaya, PRI's Vice President of Marketing and Communications, and your podcast co-host. This week we conclude our special series looking at the hot issues that will be debated in the final weeks of the 2025 legislative session with a conversation with Assemblyman Joe Patterson. Joe's a longtime friend of mine, a former legislative staffer, former mayor and council member in the city of R-Rocklin, and now represents the 5th Assembly District in the California State Assembly. We talk about Governor Newsom's redistricting proposal, which would apparently deal with attempts to rig elections in Texas by rigging elections in California. We also talk about some of the legislation that Assemblyman Patterson feels isn't getting the attention it warrants in these final days of the session, but would have huge impacts on Californians if enacted. We also talk about his efforts to ban non-disclosure agreements in the legislative process and other legislative issues. I think you'll find it a very interesting conversation. So after this message, please stay tuned for Matt Fleming and my conversation with Assemblyman Joe Patterson. Thanks for joining us. We'll get back to our great guest in just a moment. But first, are you following PRI on Facebook? By following PRI at facebook.com/Pacific Research Institute, that's all one word, you'll be the first to read free market ideas from PRI's terrific team of scholars on all the hot issues like education freedom, single-payer healthcare, crime, homelessness, green mandates like the ban on natural gas appliances, and more. Plus, when you follow PRI at facebook.com/Pacific Research Institute, you'll be the first to know when tickets go on sale for PRI's must-attend luncheons, dinners, and galas across the state. And you'll be first in line to secure your spot to hear great speakers like Michael Schellenberger, Gordon Chang, Steve Hilton, and many more. So go to facebook.com/Pacific Research Institute and follow PRI today so you'll be the first to know. Assemblyman Joe Patterson, welcome to PRI's Next Round podcast.
Well, thanks for having me.
It was great to have you on as we are about to enter the final countdown.
Yes.
And I'm going to talk about some of the things that you're working on and some of the things that may be coming up. It seems like all the talk in Sacramento, of course, is dominated by Governor Newsom's partisan redistricting scheme to gerrymander congressional districts, really to have about 2 Republicans representing California in Congress. And I don't know, of all my time working in the legislature and observing things, seems like probably the most partisan, bordering on a pretty corrupt thing that I've seen going down in the legislature, which says a lot. So what's your view as we go into this vote? How do you think this debate is going to go down? And, what can Republicans do, if anything, to prevent this from happening?
I've always been, since my time as a staff member and working on various campaign things, the idea that independent redistricting is something that I thought that was the standard here in California, right? I thought that was something that was part of our DNA. I thought that was just accepted. And it really is not surprising. I'll tell you 2 things that are not surprising to me. One is that Governor Newsom, in order to, what he thinks, balance something that's going on nationally, would be willing to deprive the rights and fairness of people in California for some kind of national recognition. That's not surprising. The other thing that is not surprising, and I think I tweeted this right at the get-go, is that Democrats would go along with it. There was no doubt in my mind when it was announced yesterday that the votes would be there, that was going to be the case. If the governor says something and he puts it out there, everybody gets in line. So I'm not really surprised by this happening, but I think you properly described it as corrupt, not in maybe, the illegal sense of the word, but in terms of the majority party using their power to get more power in a state which, by the way, they already have insane amounts of power.
Yeah, you said it's not illegal, but there is the off chance, actually not even an off chance, but a pretty strong chance that courts overturn this for myriad reasons. But we won't get into all that because we have lots of other things to talk about. But
well, I think a better description, I guess, would be criminal. It's probably not criminal, but illegal. I guess, yeah. I mean, I could see the courts throwing this out for a whole host of reasons as well.
For sure, yeah, it's definitely not criminal. It's certainly corrupt, immoral, possibly illegal, but no one's going to jail over it. You talked about Democrats falling in line. You talked about somewhat of a corrupt process, and that is a perfect segue into we were viewing this interview initially when we first booked it with you as a preview of the end of session, where there's lots of Democrats falling in line and political posturing. But over the next couple weeks, members are going to vote on hundreds of bills. Though these bills have all been around for quite some time, this is the conclusion of a nearly year-long legislative session. Members can't possibly have been given the amount of time needed to appropriately scrutinize every bill they're going to vote on. In your view, what bills aren't getting the attention that they deserve?
AB 1333 would essentially make self-defense illegal. You can be charged with a crime for defending yourself. There's also a mileage tax that's moving forward. There's a big one that I think is kind of a big deal is AB 957 that would ban places that have pharmacies. So think, Walgreens and CVS from selling tobacco. Look, I'm no smoker, but that just creates an incentive for the black market. I mean, and all these cities have smoke shops popping up everywhere. When I was on city council, I heard a lot about that. So it's not going to stop anybody who is addicted to tobacco from getting tobacco. All it's going to do is promote other ways that people are going to get it. There's a whole bunch of bills. I mean, we could go on all day long about bills that are really diving into more of the sanctuary state that look to also just do legislation to fight the Trump administration, for example. I mean, there's a bill going through right now that would stop ICE agents from wearing masks at school campuses, as if the state government can tell the federal government what to do. But ICE isn't going into schools and taking kids out of their seats. It's just not happening. But this is just a feel-good bill that will have an impact. So there are so many bills that we could go on and on. There was a new one that's really been getting a lot of attention as of late. That's AB 495. It has to do with immigration. It's a response to immigration as well as just the Trump administration in general. But it allows a quote-unquote mentor of a child to take guardianship of that child in school, for example, if the parents are unavailable. The thought from the Democrats is that would allow, if ICE came into a campus, again, that's just not really happening, that a teacher or something like that could say, hey, I'm the guardian of this child, and then make decisions for that child. But the truth is, the language is so broad that a quote unquote mentor of the child could basically be anybody. I mean, any person, nearly any person can make an argument that they have some mentorship with that child and then start making custodial decisions for that child. I mean, it's an insane bill. But I can go on and on. Let me talk about one more real quick. Again, this has to do with fighting the Trump administration, not really good public policy. But there is right now in California, if you were to get a prescription for the abortion pill, or you were to get a prescription for testosterone, these prescriptions, especially testosterone, are reported to a DOJ system because it's a controlled substance to ensure that people aren't getting multiple prescriptions for testosterone, i.e. steroids. And because the author of the bill wants to make sure that a person who, is let's say a woman who identifies as a man, get testosterone, and they don't want the federal government tracking that or having access to the state's records, they're basically eliminating the ability, or they're not basically, they are eliminating the reporting of that testosterone to the state's DOJ system. But in effect, what that means is that if you're a man, you can get testosterone from multiple clinicians and there will be no tracking for it. and it effectively allows that person to, become a steroid user without under the guidance, like actually multiple physicians prescribing this to the individual. I mean, it's just so short-sighted in response to the Trump administration. It's crazy.
One of the things that's kind of out there over all of these, end of session pushes, is this issue that you've really been a key leader in fighting on, and that's this push for a ban of the use of non-disclosure agreements in legislative negotiations. Can you kind of explain to our listeners, kind of how all this came about, why it's so important to keep continuing this fight, and where the effort stands today? I think people, right, would naturally think something like this should already be illegal, yet it's not.
Yeah, I think people can even make an argument that it already is illegal, but who's going to hold legislators accountable, right, for this? But there was legislation passed in the past where it was reported, and this legislation increased the minimum wage on fast food restaurants to $20 an hour. And it was reported and not denied that all the people involved in these negotiations signed a non-disclosure agreement. In other words, if you were involved in those legislative negotiations, you could not disclose to the public how the agreement came to, right? Like how it was developed. And that just philosophically goes against the legislative process. I mean, these things are supposed to go through public hearings and discussion about and debate. But what happens is they sign a non-disclosure agreement. They came up with the agreement and then put it through the process. And then in addition, there are thousands of people who have signed non-disclosure agreements regarding the construction of the Capitol, which nobody seems to be able to identify when it will actually be done, how much it will cost, where supplies are coming from. And even as a legislator, I can't get access to that information. So legislators have signed non-disclosure agreements regarding that. And my legislation would essentially prohibit that practice in regards to legislating. So legislators wouldn't be able to do it regarding negotiations, development, discussion of legislation. And that is currently that's currently moving through the legislative process quite nicely. But it was narrowed down because I really wanted to prohibit lobbyists from signing non-disclosure agreements and businesses too that were involved in the legislative process with lobbyists. But actually, the California Chamber of Commerce at the time came out opposed, and in one respect, I get it, but they didn't want to be involved in, essentially we're restricting their right to sign contractual agreements. And I get sort of that theory. However, if you're involved in a public process, which by design is supposed to be a public process, I don't think businesses should be signing non-disclosure agreements either. Now, their discussions with their lobbyists and lawyers don't have to be public. Those are protected. And so I took them out. I took businesses out of it. It only applies to legislators now. It doesn't even apply to the governor's office. So we took kind of a narrow approach. It only applies to legislators. And it also doesn't apply to, trade secrets and private financial information and things like that. So we tried to narrow it down as much to just the legislative process and just the legislators. But I look at it as a first step, not the last step.
We'll get back to Next Round in just a moment, but first, are you getting PRI's regular email updates? If not, go to pacificresearch.org and click the sign up button at the top of the page to get the facts you need to fight back delivered every week to your inbox. Every week, PRI sends you what you need to know about what's going on in Washington, D.C. and Sacramento, and gives you the free market ideas needed to save our state and our nation. By going to pacificresearch.org and clicking the sign up button, you can sign up to have Policy Alert, our weekly roundup of all the best ideas from PRI scholars delivered to your inbox. Or you can sign up for event updates so you're the first to know when PRI is coming to your community with great events. So sign up now at pacificresearch.org and click the sign up button at the top of the page to get PRI's content delivered to your inbox each week.
Another really interesting bill you have is in December, you introduced a bill to rein in escalating energy costs by requiring regulations proposed by the California Air Resources Board to be first given nonpartisan analysis. A lot of these bills follow a similar theme in good government, in transparency. Why is this particular law with CARB, why is it important? I mean, as someone who, regularly gets a $700 PG&E bill for my electricity, and I do not have a big house, nor do we run our energy all the time. But someone who gets like it's one of the most substantial bills I get. I love this just on its face. But I mean, can you talk about like legislatively and policy wise, why is this important?
Yeah. The reason for our high energy costs in California is largely because of decisions made by regulators, not the legislature. And one great example of that is the governor's ban on gasoline powered vehicles by, I don't remember what year it was, 2035. That ban was an executive order by the governor to instruct regulators to make regulations that would ban the sale of gas powered cars. And again, that didn't go through the legislative process. So there was no analysis, there was no public debate within the legislature, and the governor did it all by himself and gave it to the regulators. So what they're doing now or what they have been doing is crafting a series of regulations that raise the cost of living. And that's just one example. I mean, the low carbon fuel standard, even little fees that they tack on at the gas station, whether it's enhanced vapor recovery phase 1 or phase 2. I mean, these little regulations add cents and sometimes tens of cents to every single gallon of gas. And so all I was saying is, because with the low carbon fuel standard, they initially identified that it would be something like 47 cents a gallon. Their changes would increase gasoline about 47 cents a gallon. And then they really backtracked off of that and they said, hey, we can't figure out how much it's going to increase gas. Well, I don't think they should be passing regulations without an actual effect on the consumer. They'll tell you, well, it's going to save healthcare costs, $1 bazillion because people are going to have cleaner air. And, some left-wing think tank, I'm sure, came up with some analysis that said the air is going to be cleaner. And so therefore it'll bring down healthcare costs. I have never seen healthcare costs go down, by the way. All this work that CARB is doing, all the passage of the American Affordable Care Act or whatever, has not brought down healthcare costs. Nothing, none of this. And so all I'm saying is, before you move forward with the regulation, please say what it's going to cost to the actual consumer. Of course, that bill went nowhere because, just to be frank, the Democratic elite have zero desire to know how much they're actually jacking up your cost of living, because if they told you, they'd actually be held accountable for it.
So you've been a big supporter of CEQA reform throughout your career, and we had, just before we left for summer recess in the budget, a really big reform proposal that was enacted as part of the budget. What do you think of what was included in this legislation? And when you think about it in the broader question, right? You see the rebuilding of Los Angeles after the devastating fires earlier this year has been so slow. What does this say about the ability to really greenlight the kind of building that we want to see, even in non-emergency situations, right? We need to see, we don't want to have government roadblocks standing in the way of much needed housing construction all over the state.
Yeah. This has been a touchy subject, even with Republican circles, because, the truth is, I think people are just naturally kind of against development, and more cars and all those sorts of things. But at the end of the day, I mean, CEQA is a major roadblock to developing anything. I mean, look, I am totally against high-speed rail. I can't tell you how against high-speed rail I am. But part of the reason why that thing costs tens of billions of dollars more is because of the CEQA process and the ongoing litigation to that process. And the taxpayers are paying for it, by the way. I mean, that's all public funds. It's all public money paying for it. So even for a project that I think is reprehensible, like the high-speed rail project, the reality is that it's costing taxpayers so much money to do these insane environmental analyses. And after you do a CEQA document, you're not required to actually mitigate whatever harm that project makes. You just have to show the harm it's going to make, and then you have to show alternatives, and you don't even have to do those alternatives. So all it is a disclosure document. It's not a decision-making document. And that disclosure slows down every single project. I mean, even within cities, when you're trying to build a house, you have to go through a CEQA document. If you're doing a small subdivision, even in an area that's intended for housing, it's already zoned for housing. And a lot of times cities will make you do that just so they make sure they check the box and they're not, there's no litigation that arises from that. So what this legislation did coming out of the legislature, which was pretty bipartisan, was it said on housing projects in areas that are intended for housing, that cities will not be required to force the developer to do CEQA. They'll still have to comply with all federal NEPA environmental regulations, which every other state complies with. They just won't have to do the specialized CEQA process. And one more point on that is, in these projects, if an area is zoned for housing, there has already been a CEQA document when the city created the general plan for not that project, but for that area that said, hey, this is going to have housing. Let's make sure we do a CEQA document as we prepare the general plan. That's required under law already. So all this is doing is just saying, hey, we're not going to do the second CEQA document on this project. And so it was a pretty modest change. But you still have people out there that's like, this is going to allow unfettered development everywhere. No, not really. What it's going to do is it's actually going to, because of a lot of the strings attached, it's actually going to kind of limit its usefulness, and it will limit it mostly to urban areas.
Let's talk local issues here for a second. Like you, I'm a Placer County resident. Placer County is traditionally pretty conservative, but that's changing with what appears to be an influx of more Democratic voters moving from big liberal areas like Sacramento and the Bay Area. I could certainly say that's true on my street. The way I see it, and feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but the way I see it is that many of these people are escaping, big government policies that they've pushed for and are now clamoring for in Placer County. And to put it another way is they're looking for something where the government is a little less intrusive. The cost of living is significantly cheaper. Things from the government seem to get done a little bit faster. And to me, there seems like a disconnect. And look, I'm not trying to criticize voters for how they vote. And I'm not asking you to criticize anybody for how they vote. But just from a political science perspective, and as someone who is an elected official representing all kinds of people, I mean, what do you make of this trend, and what do you think this means for Placer County long term?
I think historically over the last 10 years, 15 years, 20 years really, as you've seen growth in Placer County and El Dorado County. Yes, I think the numbers have trended to become more liberal. I mean, we see that in the voter registration numbers. So, I mean, that's not, inaccurate to say or anything. But I will say, I do challenge people a little bit that mention that live in my county because that I live, because, for example, if you look at the voter registration in my seat, when my seat was drawn in December 2021, there was a 10.3 voter registration advantage. By the time I was elected and started office, I think that first in March 2023, I think we were down to 9.6% voter registration advantage. So we dropped, as you mentioned. However, I think the most recent, we were hovering around 13% voter registration advantage. So I actually think as of late, the influx of people moving to the area have been Republicans escaping those areas, to be honest with you. I don't know if that's unique. I mean, we have to pay attention to the trends. We've seen the trend of Republican registration increasing in every legislative district in the state. It is a little bit outsized in my district. So it's something we have to keep an eye on. But just to go to a little bit to the hypocrisy of some individuals, especially I see this on the school board front all the time. They move to this area because of the high quality schools that we have in Placer County. And then they show up at school board meetings ticked off that the school board is making some kind of decision. And it's like, wait a second, what got us to this point in the first place? It wasn't left-wing progressive politics. It was a school board that made various decisions, probably with a conservative bend. But why don't we put a little bit more trust and faith in the people making the decisions for our schools? Because they obviously got us to this point. And then one last point I'll say on that is the state has intentionally, especially when it comes to schools, caused so much friction between school boards and community members that it's really highlighted some of these differences and engaged more people to show up at least loudly at school board meetings. I mean, there's people who show up at all these school board meetings screaming at the school board members, yet the school board members are consistently getting reelected. But the state has driven a wedge between local communities and their school boards.
Well, Joe, we got one question for you as we close out. We call this podcast the Next Round Podcast because of our proximity to Napa and other excellent California wine regions. So what are you drinking these days to unwind from tough days of lawmaking? Is it wine? Is it beer? Is it the hard stuff? Maybe after this redistricting debate, you'll need something hard. Or is it something completely different? What are you drinking nowadays?
Yeah, well, I don't think you guys are asking for a lecture from Joe Patterson, but I'm from Napa, born and raised in Napa. Actually, just attended my 25-year reunion on Saturday. So I love wine. I never was exposed to wine until way after college, really. But I mean, my favorite type of drink is bourbon for sure, 100%. That's what I like. I do enjoy wine. I mean, Placer County honestly has amazing wines out here. So there's some great things, Wise Villa, there's some really great wineries out here. But Joe Patterson really isn't drinking that much anymore. Not because I'm against it. I just, the older I get, it impacts me more. It's become more detrimental to my health. And so I'm maybe if I even drank once a week, it'd be surprising to me. So that, that's not, hey, people can do whatever they want. I don't really care. Some people, you need that drink. I was there, but not drinking a whole lot. But if I had to crack something open, it would definitely be a bourbon.
Well, Joe, thanks for joining us for Next Round. We really appreciate it.
All right. Thanks, guys. I appreciate it.
If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Itchon. Hope you'll come back again for Next Round with PRI.